Welcome to another weekly episode, mainly weekly, of 3 Minute Therapy podcast on YouTube and on a podcast channel called Podbean. And 3 Minute Therapy is oriented around REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy. And that's a very effective, powerful type of brief therapy devised by Albert Ellis starting in the 1950s and now carried on by many, many therapists. And it also spawned the many cognitive therapy and cognitive behavior therapy approaches around. And that most therapists, I believe, incorporate some of it in their practice. Whereas in the old days, it was mainly Freudian psychoanalytic premises, but now Albert Ellis created a major paradigm shift in psychotherapy, for which we can be very, very thankful. Rational emotive behavior therapy is based on one simple premise, and that is our emotions and our thinking, rather our emotions and our behavior comes from our thinking. So if you're acting in self-destructive ways, or if you have undesirable, disturbed emotions like anxiety, depression, or anger, guilt, many others, then look to your thinking and change your thinking. So you don't need therapy for months or years, and you don't need to dwell on your childhood. Just ask yourself, what am I telling myself right now that causes my emotional and behavioral problems? And then question, challenge, and contradict that. Because if you have problems, that means your thinking is not aligned with reality. There's something off about your thinking, and your thinking cannot be supported empirically with evidence. When you look for your irrational or unreasonable or disturbed thinking, usually it's in the form of demands: musts, shoulds, supposed tos, have tos, demands you put on yourself, others, or situations in your life, and takes the general form of I must do well and get approval, others must treat me well, and life must be fair, easy, and hassle-free. Today, we will be applying this to sports. And by way of a slightly longer introduction, I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein. I'm a clinical psychologist who specializes in REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, and I have remote practice on various remote sites. I'm joined every week by my partner, Kevin Benbow, also an REBT therapist located in Yuma, Arizona. And we're always joined by Chris Rossini, who off scenes does the technical part of this and helps us get through when there are technical problems. So in discussing sports psychology, there are many aspects to that. One of the main ones is how to improve your performance in your sport. That's more, that's less related to emotional problems or behavioral problems, but you can get more information about that on various websites. And Kevin might have a few things to say about that. But I'm mainly going to focus on emotional problems that interfere with performing well in sports. And the two main ones are anxiety, which tends to interfere with performance. And that comes from certain musts. I must do well. I must not screw things up. I must catch everything that comes my way, etc. And then there's a secondary disturbance about the anxiety, and that is I must not be anxious. It would be awful, terrible, and horrible if I was anxious and my performance suffered. And in baseball, for example, which is a sport I'm familiar with, it's called choking. So sometimes a player is doing well, and then he starts thinking, I must not choke. I must continue my great performance. I must continue to impress my fans. And that will lead to secondary disturbance and a dramatic drop in performance. And so when you have a disturbance about a disturbance, A, you're anxious, and then B, I must not be anxious, then that tends to make things worse. The solution, as usual, is to question and challenge and contradict your musts, your shoulds. And if you do, if you ask yourself, what's the evidence? I absolutely have to do well. I absolutely must not be anxious or choke. You'll see there's never any evidence for musts and shoulds. That's the bottom line. One of the themes of reality. There are no musts, there are no shoulds. There are just very, very strong preferences. You have a strong preference to do well. If you're in the World Series, you have a very strong preference to do well, but there's no reason why you have to. If you don't, you don't. Reality is reality, not what you think it should be. So I will step aside now. And Kevin, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I actually have a question here, Michael. Let's imagine there's a baseball player who's going for the tryouts. He wants to get on his favorite team, and he has a strong preference that he succeed in the tryouts. Uh, Really, when we've talked about this briefly before with shoulds and musts. I mean, there are certain things that he has to do in order to be accepted by the team, to be as a player. Could you help differentiate between that sort of demand, the demand made by the team, and what's the difference there between that and what we call a strong preference?
Great question. And I'm often asked this. And the answer is there are two meanings of have to. I have to do well. It could be a conditional have to, or to phrase it a little differently, it's a preferential have to. I preferentially have to do well, or it's an if then have to. If I'm going to get on the team, I have to do well, although that's often false. Also, there might be other aspects to your history, for example, might get you on the team, even if a particular performance isn't terrific. But uh, so so the conditional have to is not really the absolute one we're talking about. The unconditional have to. Another uh, obvious example of a conditional have to is if I want to get to the airport by 5, then I have to leave my house by 4. But I would translate that is into if I want to get to the airport by 5, it would be highly preferable if I leave my house by 4, but it's probably not necessary. If there's less traffic and you leave 10 after 4, you might get there on time. Or if the plane could be late, another reason why you don't absolutely have to get to the airport at a particular time, or they purposely give you a time that's earlier than the flight to make sure you get there on time. So there are various reasons why the have to, even in the non-absolute sense, may be false. But in the absolute sense, which is I have to get to the airport on time. If I don't, I'll definitely miss my plane. That would be terrible, awful, and horrible, and prove I'm worthless. I'm no good because I got there late. that type of have to is always false. Does that answer the question, Kevin?
Yeah, it sure does. It answers it for me. It sounds like, generally speaking, when we're talking about unhealthy negative emotions, anxiety, depression, rage, those anger, those sorts of things, we're talking about shoulds and musts that are basically universals. We're making a demand that the universe has to cooperate with us, that it has to do this or that. And that's where our disturbed emotion comes from. I find in working with clients something interesting. Some people's preferences can be awfully strong, to put it mildly. Let's take somebody who's I don't know, someone who, since they've been a child, their ambition has been to be a major league baseball player. And they have centered everything, pinned all of their hopes on this. And then they get to the tryouts. And as they go into the tryouts, it's hard. It seems to me when I work with people like this, it's hard for them, hard for me anyway, to get them to distinguish between the preferential I have to perform well in order to be accepted by the team, or just to a certain level to be accepted by the team, versus the universe owes this to me type of thing. And so that's one difficulty I find personally working with persons like that.
Yeah, yeah. And I get that also from clients. And their assumption is, or sometimes they state it, there's a thin line between a very, very strong preference and a have to. And I tell them it's not a thin line, there's a universe of difference. It's like saying there's a thin line between on Christmas time, a man on the corner in a red suit and a white beard ringing a bell and saying, ho, 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 Merry Christmas. There's a thin line between that and the Santa Claus that's flying through the sky being pulled by reindeer on a shed. There's on a sled rather. There's a thin line. Well, there's a universe difference between reality. In this case, there is no Santa Claus. It's a fiction. And in the case you're bringing up, what you strongly prefer to do because you want to avoid bad consequences, and what you absolutely have to do that's awful, terrible, and horrible if you don't do it, that makes you a bad, worthwhile, losing person. And that is something that you couldn't stand if it happens. So there's a universe of difference between reality and the fictional ideas we have about reality.
And then it's all, of course, in the quality, if that's a right way to say it, of the emotion that the person experiences. If they're self-deprecating, I didn't make the tryouts, therefore I am a horrible human being. Well, that would be psychologically unhealthy. It might be true they're not the greatest baseball player. It might be true they're not a good baseball player. But it doesn't mean they're a horrible human being or that they're a loser for not making the team. And while they might be disappointed in doing something else for a living, it's not going to be the end of the world, though they might believe it is for a while.
Yeah. And I tell people, well, it would be the end of the world if I, for example, a more extreme example, if I had terminal cancer. It would be the end of the world. And I tell them, even in that case, it's not the end of the world. The world will still go on if you die from cancer or in other ways. So it's not the end of the world. You could make a case it's the end of your world, but that's sort of subjective, really. It's the end of your life in the world. That would be more accurate, I think, not the end of the world. And then when people object, well, I couldn't stand it, then I point out to them why you're telling yourself you couldn't stand it. You are standing it. So that's a contradiction.
Yeah, it might be very, very unpleasant to have one's dreams shattered by reality, that maybe they're not going to make the grade to meet a team, to be part of a team. But that doesn't mean life won't go on. How they deal with it afterward is going to make all the difference in the world.
Yes, yes. And note that we're not downplaying the importance. Something could be very unpleasant, as Kevin said, or very, very, very unpleasant at the 99.9 99% level, but it's still on the same scale of unpleasantness, not on a different scale of world ending scenarios or awfuls, terribles, or horribles, or bad people. There are no such thing as bad, worthless people. There are just our humanness, imperfect humans who act imperfectly. That's the worst you could be in terms of your self, an imperfect human who acts imperfectly. So it's always wrong to condemn yourself and think of yourself as a bad person, a loser, worthless, a failure, those kinds of things.
So how do our thoughts then? I have a couple ideas, but how do our unhealthy, irrational beliefs and thoughts get in the way of improving our performance in sports?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I'll give one answer and then I'd like to hear
Mhm.
yours. So, one of the main ways is when you're anxious and you have these musts, it tends to disorganize your thoughts, lead to obsessing, dwelling, and ruminating on the bad possibilities. And it's harder to think straight and perform well in sports or anything else. So that's one of the main ways it interferes.
And I can certainly see, as a musician. Of course, I actually did practice karate for several years. I played baseball, basketball, those sorts of things. But improvement comes with practice. But I know from personal experience, if I tell myself that I have to win this match, for example, that I absolutely must, that's going to create a lot of anxiety, and I'm probably going to get my ass kicked. Now I might win. I might win. That's possible, but more than likely the anxiety is going to get in the way. Just this past Veterans Day, a little bit different tack, but as a musician, I've been getting ready for a Veterans Day talent show. Been performing the same pieces of music daily, working on them, play them absolutely lovely in my home. Get to the talent show, and boom, it's chaotic. There's all kinds of noise going on, and I made a few mistakes that I don't know if anybody else will. One piece definitely was noticed because it ended abruptly, but I don't know if anybody noticed the other mistakes that were there. But it was not the end of the world, and I survived it. And I'll probably play there again next year. But I guess what I'm saying is we we tell ourselves that we have to improve. You know, what happens in the case of injury? People oftentimes, for example, will ruin their joints because they excessively train, because they tell themselves they must improve. I mean, there's that aspect of this too, isn't there, Michael?
Yes, yes, that's a very good point. People get injuries in sports, which is somewhat common, and then they have a few musts there. I must not stop and rest and recover. I must keep going. And then they make the injury worse and worse. And also, I must do better each time I go out, especially
Mhm.
in a performance sport where you can practice on your own, like running, and you can time your running and those kinds of things, or weight resistance exercises or weight lifting contests. I must do better each time, and then you overdo it. And it's hard. It's definitely important to be somewhat moderate in your training and use self discipline not to overdo it. Write out a schedule in advance and stick to the schedule. So those are some
Hmm.
problems.
Is it really possible to be better every time? I mean, if that were true over a period of years, I mean, how fast would I possibly be running? Uh, I used to work for a company whose motto was "Be faster every day than the day you were before." I don't think that's physically. I don't think that's physically achievable. Maybe
Yeah,
more efficient, yes, but
you raise an interesting issue that some people understandably have, and that is when you're very young. as you get older, you do get better every time. I remember I'm a competitive runner, and I remember when I was young, each time I had a better time for a 10K or 5K. And then at some point, I stopped having better times, and now I have slower times. So, so to be better every time is okay, unrealistic when you're younger, but at some point that continued improvement stops. But the real issue here from a therapeutic point of view is get rid of the must. I must be better every time, and if I'm not, I'm no good. Another variant to that with some sports is I must have a good training session every time. In running, I must have a good run, feel great, no pain, no aches, and do as well or better than I did last time. So that's another one in terms of the first must. I must do well. And if I don't, I'm a failure. So that's another must to get over.
And then in any area of endeavor, sports or whatever it is, progress is oftentimes incremental. We go forward, we make progress, and then we go backward a little bit.
Right,
It's
right.
not a straight line proposition as most of us would like it to be. And so the important thing is to continue going forward, even though we might have a few bad training sessions. Gosh, it's possible to have quite a few bad training sessions over the course of time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no more improvement to be made. Other changes, a new trainer, a new coach, whatever it is that can be tried.
Yes, I'm glad you brought up your music talents, because the emotional problems that apply to sports directly apply to music also. I must have a good practice. I must do well when I'm performing. I must do better each time, make fewer mistakes, do it perfectly. And so that comes into play there with music and other things, also public speaking. So there are many things that these types of musts that we see in sports psychology are relevant.
Years ago, I was emailing with Dr. Rob Heineman he's over at the Beck Institute, and he mentioned in passing that your orchestral musicians seem to have more social anxiety than any other population because there is so much pressure placed on them to be precise in their
Yes,
music.
yes, yes,
Mhm.
yes. It's so rare that you see a musical performance where someone makes a mistake, or at least I don't recognize their mistakes,
Right.
and
Mhm.
I really admire how they do that.
Mhm.
And I imagine it takes practice, 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 and then when you get it perfectly, continued practice.
Mhm.
And
But
also working on their anxiety. Maybe that's an in for you and me as
mhm.
REBT therapists, helping
Mhm.
performers with their performance anxiety.
Right. Right. And as a musician, I would say no performance is ever 100% perfect. There's all it's what really happens is we develop a talent for covering up our mistakes, and
Oh,
that's an important
yeah,
skill.
yeah, yeah.
How to pass over a problem passage and just go someplace else and try to make that as seamless as possible. Another musician might catch it if they know the score, but the average person, it might get right past them, and that's kind of what we're going for.
Yes, yes.
Mhm.
Very good, Kevin. Okay, is there anything else you wanted to add before we close?
No, I'm happy.
Okay, very good, very good. So, if you want to help with your sports performance and your sports anxiety, then this Kevin and I might have said some things that'll help you. We're here every week, as I said, almost every week. We're not perfect, but almost every week, with the help of Chris Rossini. And if you would like to make a comment below, please do. If you'd like to give us a thumbs up, please do. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, please do. And practice your REBT therapy as much as possible. Daily would be a good goal. And do that to stay on the rational side of life. See you next week.